Hi guys, good day to everyone. Let's continue with our discussion about the muscles of the upper limb. So right now we are at the level of the forearm. So in the forearm, you have three groups of muscle. You have the anterior group, you have the posterior group, and you have the lateral group. Okay, so let's start with the anterior group of muscles of the forearm. So the anterior, oops, sorry. So the anterior group of the anterior forearm are further subdivided into uh, superficial, intermediate, and deep. Okay, so let's start with the superficial group of muscles of the anterior forearm. So these are four muscles. You have the you have the pronator teres. Okay, you have the flexor carpi radialis, you have the palmaris longus, and you have the flexor carpi ulnaris. So let's start with the pronator teres. By the way, the common origin of the muscles of the anterior forearm is usually the medial epicondyle. Okay, so most of them have origin from the medial epicondyle. Okay, so let's continue with the pronator teres muscle. So pronator teres has origin from the medial epicondyle. Okay, at the same time, it has also origin from the ulna, particularly the coronoid process. And this will insert at the shaft of the radius on the lateral side. Okay? If you observe, uh, the pronator teres process two joints. You have the elbow joint and your radioulnar joint. So it can produce two movements. Okay, so it can pronate the forearm. At the same time, it can flex the forearm. Actually, when you say flex the forearm, it is the same with flexion of the elbow. Okay, and the pronator teres is supplied with a median nerve. So by the way, most of the muscles of the anterior forearm is supplied by a median nerve. Okay, so that is your first muscle. You have the pronator teres. Okay, let's go to the next. We have the flexor carpi radialis. So again, as I have said, the common origin of the muscles of the anterior forearm is medial epicondyle. So flexor carpi radialis have origin from the medial epicondyle, and it is inserted to the hands, specifically to the base of the second and third metacarpal bone. Okay, so you have the first and the I mean the second and the third metacarpal bone. So this is the lateral side of the hands. And since okay, so I will add letter E right here. Letter E, elbow. Okay, so since the flexor carpi radialis is crossing the elbow, it can flex the elbow, and since it is also crossing the wrist, it can flex the wrist. So the W is the wrist, and I add the E, the elbow. Aside from flexion of the elbow and flexion of the wrist, it can also abduct the wrist. Or you can call this radial deviation. Okay? So if you move your wrist to the lateral, that is called radial deviation. So it's easy to take note because it is radialis. Okay? So it can also produce movement like abduction of the wrist, and we call that as radial deviation. Okay, and again, as I have said, most of the muscles of the anterior forearm are supplied by the median nerve. Okay, so that is now your flexor carpi radialis. Okay, let's continue with the third. And just erase this one. Okay, let's go to the next. Okay, palmaris longus. So palmaris longus, again, common origin. You have the medial epicondyle. Okay, so as the name implies, palmaris, it is inserted at the palmar aponeurosis, right here. Okay, so that is your palmar aponeurosis. Of course, we know that aponeurosis is a flat tendon. Okay, so since your palmaris longus is inserted, or I mean crosses the elbow, you can flex the elbow. Okay, again, let's add letter E. Okay, and at the same time, it crosses the wrist, so it's also flex the wrist. So flexion of the wrist, flexion of the elbow. Okay, and it is again supplied by the median nerve. Okay, so you have palmaris longus. So let's go to the next muscle. So flexor carpi ulnaris. Okay, so this is on the ulnar side, the most medial. Okay, so again, this is the lateral and this is the medial side. Okay, so the origin of your flexor carpi ulnaris is the same. You have the medial epicondyle, but it has also an ulnar origin, actually at the shaft, okay, or medial aspect of the ulna. Okay, and you know the olecranon process, right? So it's also part of the ulna. Actually, you have three origins. You have the medial epicondyle, and you have two origins from the ulna, the medial aspect, at the same time the olecranon process. So you know that the olecranon process is at the posterior part of the ulna. Okay, and you can anticipate or you can assume for the insertion. Okay, so if you remember a while ago, the insertion of the flexor carpi is the second and third metacarpal bone. So radialis is on the lateral side, and the bones in the hand, the metacarpal bones on the lateral side is metacarpal number 2 and metacarpal number 3. Okay, but on the medial side, you have fifth metacarpal and you have the hamate. Okay, so metacarpal bone and you have the carpal bone, namely the pisiform and the hamate. Okay, so pisiform, the hamate, and the fifth metacarpal are located at the medial part of the hands. Okay, so again, your flexor carpi ulnaris crosses the elbow, so it can flex the elbow. Okay, again, we will add letter E for the elbow. Okay, sorry class, I wasn't able to add. Okay, and since it is crossing the wrist joint, it also flexes the wrist. Okay, aside from that, your flexor carpi ulnaris can also pull the hands towards the medial side, and you call that now ulnar deviation, or that is adduction of the wrist. Okay, so when you say ulnar deviation, the other term for that is adduction of the wrist. Okay, so take note class, I add letter E for the flexion. Okay, so flexion of the elbow and flexion of the wrist. Okay, and aside from that, we have adduction of the wrist. So a while ago, when you say radial deviation, RD, that is abduction of the wrist. Okay, abduct. But when you say ulnar deviation, that is adduction of the wrist. Okay, I hope that is clear. Okay, so again, you have four muscles. Okay, and this is the unique part of the flexor carpi ulnaris, because most of the muscles of the anterior forearm is supplied by the ulnar nerve. I mean the medial nerve. The flexor carpi ulnaris is supplied by the ulnar nerve. Okay, so summary of the muscles of the anterior forearm, the superficial group of muscles of the anterior forearm. First, we have, okay, for a while, okay, pronator teres. Okay, again, the origin is from the lateral epicondyle towards the shaft of the radius. So, it does not cross the wrist, but it only crosses the elbow. So, it can only flex the elbow. Okay, second muscle, you have the flexor carpi radialis. So origin is again medial epicondyle, and the insertion actually is the second and the third metacarpal bone, the base. Okay, the base of the second, okay, the base of the second and the third metacarpal bone. Okay, next, your palmaris longus. Okay, and it is inserted at the palmar of aponeurosis. Okay, so again, the origin is common, medial epicondyle. Okay, and the last one is the flexor carpi ulnaris. Again, has origin from the medial epicondyle and inserted to the pisiform, the hamate, and the base of the fifth metacarpal bone. Okay, if you observe, they have a common origin. You have the medial epicondyle. Okay, but some of these muscles have two origin, like your pronator teres. Okay, origin from the medial epicondyle, at the same time the ulna. The same thing with the flexor carpi ulnaris. Okay, so all of them flex the elbow because they cross the elbow, but not all of them can flex the wrist because the palmaris longus, the pronator teres does not cross does not cross the wrist. It only cross the elbow. Okay, let's continue, guys. So we will now go to the intermediate group. So actually you have only one. You have the flexor digitorum superficialis. Okay, so the origin is, okay, when you say you have humero-ulnar head, so you have the medial epicondyle, and this is your ulnar origin. Okay, the coronoid. Okay, and you have the radial head. Okay, so in red, okay, in X, so you have the uh, humerus, the ulna, and the radius. So you have three origins, three bones. You have the humerus, specifically the medial epicondyle, ulna, you have the coronoid process, and you have the radial head, the oblique line of the anterior surface of the shaft of the radius. This is the part, okay, this part right here. Okay, so that's the origin. Then of course you have the insertion. Okay, so actually you have four insertions. You have the second, the third, the fourth, and the fifth middle phalanx. Okay, please take note, middle phalanx of the medial four fingers. When you say medial four, this is the medial four because the most lateral is the thumb. Okay, so please take note because later on your flexor digitorum profundus it insert on the distal phalanx. Okay, so please take note of that. Okay, so let's count how many joints do the flexor digitorum profundalis crosses. So first it crosses the elbow, so it flexes the elbow. Again, I apologize, I was able to put letter E. So it crosses the elbow, it crosses the wrist, it crosses the MCP, and it crosses the proximal interphalangeal joint. So therefore, it can flex the elbow, it can flex the wrist, it can flex your MCP, and it can flex your PIP. So flex the elbow, letter E, flex the wrist, flex the MCP, and flex the PIP. Okay, so how many joints is that? That's four. Okay, so you have a lot of movements there. Okay, so let's proceed. Okay, so nerve supply of the same, you have the median nerve. So again, your flexor digitorum superficialis, I think crosses four joints. Okay, so it's flex the elbow, flex the wrist, flex the MCP, and flex the PIP. Okay, but I am only talking about the medial four. I am not talking about the thumb. Okay, so let's go to the uh, summary of your flexor digitorum superficialis. So your flexor digitorum superficialis have origin, okay, at the medial epicondyle. It has origin from the ulna, and it has origin from the radius. Okay, so I just put origin. Okay, and it is inserted where? Okay, so you have the insertion. Okay, so this is the middle phalanx of the second, the third, the fourth, and the fifth. So therefore, it can flex the elbow, it can flex the wrist, it can flex the MCP, it can flex the PIP, but not the DIP. Okay. Okay. Okay, let's proceed guys to the deep muscle of the anterior forearm. Okay. So you have the flexor pollicis. Actually, please put there longus. Okay. Flexor pollicis longus. Oh, sorry. Nagali sa dalom. Okay, I didn't notice. Okay, your flexor pollicis longus, your flexor digitorum profundus, and you have your pronator quadratus. Okay, so you have four from the superficial, one from the intermediate, and you have three from the deep. Okay, so let's go to the first muscle. Okay, so your flexor pollicis. Okay, when you say, of course you know what is pollicis, you are now referring to the thumb. Okay, so the origin of your flexor pollicis longus is from the anterior shaft. Okay, that's the anterior shaft, and it is inserted, okay, at the distal phalanx of the thumb. Actually, in the hands, if you can see the longus, you are sure that the insertion is distal phalanx. Okay, so from the radius, it is inserted to the distal phalanx of the thumb. Okay, so what is the action of this? So it can flex the thumb, of course. Flexor, pollicis, longus. Okay, so it can move the MCP. Yes, it can move the MCP because it crosses the MCP. It can flex the interpharyngeal. Okay, it can move the thumb, flex the thumb. Okay, you have there the saddle joint. Okay, and it can also cross the wrist. Okay, in some way it can move the wrist, but uh, a weak movement of the wrist, flexion of the wrist, but it is more of deflection of the thumb. So, and again, the common nerve supply of the anterior group is the median nerve. Okay, so that is your flexor, pollicis, longus. Okay, origin is radius, insertion is of course the distal phalanx of the thumb. Next, you have the flexor digitorum profundus. So the origin of your flexor digitorum profundus, you have a lot. Okay, so you have the anterior and medial shaft of the ulna. So you have anterior and at the side medial shaft. So as you observe, your flexor digitorum profundus don't have origin from the humerus. So therefore, it doesn't cross the elbow, right? So if it doesn't cross the elbow, it cannot move the elbow joint. So wala. Okay? But it is inserted where? The distal phalanx. So right here. Okay, so kaina, your superficialis, your flexor digitorum superficialis, has insertion at the middle phalanx, but this time your profundus insert in the distal phalanx. Okay, so it's further, but the superficialis have origin from the humerus. Amo naman na ang uh, lain sa yung mga superficialis. Okay, it can move the elbow, but the profundus cannot move the elbow. Okay, it can only move the wrist, it can move the MCP, it can move the PIP, at the same time, it can move the DIP. Okay, so bali, maidog ka lang isa. Okay, masaka, panaog ka lang. Wala sa elbow, but you move to the DIP. Okay, so therefore, your flexor digitorum profundus moves the wrist, okay, right here, because it crosses the wrist joint. It moves the MCP right here because it crosses the MCP joint. It moves the PIP, okay, right here because it crosses the PIP joint of the second, third, fourth, and fifth finger. At the same time, it also moved the DIP, okay? So, among the muscles of the upper limb, ang profundus lang gid ang makamove sang DIP. Wala nang iba. Okay? It's only the DIP. Okay, so flexion of the distal phalanx, assist in the flexion of the middle proximal phalanx. Okay, the wrist. Okay, so if you observe, the wrist lang ang pinaka proximal, wala elbow because it doesn't cross the elbow. Okay, so the last one will be your pronator quadratus. Of course, so it's a very short muscle. Okay, so actually it has origin from the ulna, okay, and insertion sa radius. So it will just pull the radius to go to the medial side. So that is pronation. Okay, so origin, you have the anterior shaft of the ulna. Okay, right here. and you have the anterior shaft of the radius. Actually, is the anterior distal shaft. Okay. Then, of course, it is the forearm, and of course, your median nerve is the nerve supply. Okay. So, among the muscles, you have the flexor carpi ulnaris na different because it has an ulnar nerve innervation. Okay. So, before I forget, okay, let's go back to the superficialis because I forgot something. Okay. Wala. Okay. Okay, nagali. Okay. Now, the nerve supply of your flexor digitorum profundus is median and ulnar nerve. Okay, so we will discuss them later at the summary. Okay. So this is the deep muscle of the forearm. So number 1 is your flexor digitorum profundus with insertion at the distal or distal phalanx, namely the second, the third, the fourth, and the fifth. Okay. Next is your flexor pollicis longus inserted at the distal phalanx of the thumb, and you have pronator quadratus. So this is the origin and this is the insertion. Okay, so that is your deep muscle of the anterior forearm. Okay, so let's look at the summary. Okay, now when we talk of the nerve supply, okay, so the anterior forearm superficial, so the three are median, only the flexor carpi ulnaris is supplied with the ulnar nerve. Okay, so all of them are median nerve except the flexor carpi ulnaris. Okay, your flexor digitorum superficialis, so you have median nerve. Okay, and the deep muscles are your flexor pollicis longus, flexor digitorum profundus, and you have your pronator quadratus. Okay, all of them median nerve except for the flexor digitorum profundus. Why? Half is ulnar, half is median. What do I mean by this? Okay, so what do I mean by this? So, if you remember, you have four tendons, okay, and this is controlled by the median, that is from the muscles, okay. So, one half of the muscles of the flexor digitorum profundus is supplied by the median, and one half of the muscles of the flexor digitorum profundus is supplied by the ulnar. So, in summary, you have two muscles of the anterior forearm that is supplied by the ulnar nerve. That is your flexor carpi ulnaris. At the same time, your flexor digitorum profundus. So all of the muscles of the anterior forearm are supplied by the median nerve except the flexor carpi ulnaris and the flexor digitorum profundus. Your flexor digitorum profundus is supplied by the ulnar and median nerve. Okay, so that is now our anterior group of muscles of the forearm.